Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Box Store Commander Challenge series. So for this particular episode we're going to be concentrating on the various sealed product in terms of mainly pre-constructed decks that might be available to you at a box store, with the idea that you could then use that particular product to modify your commander deck or add to your commander toolkit. Because really when I'm doing this series, there's two distinct areas here that work together. One is cards that are going into a sort of toolkit which you can use for commander EDH generally, and the other is that cards you might particularly want to use to modify at the moment what is our core deck. So the first question is, just for recap, is what is our core deck? Well, the core deck that I wanted to build this whole toolkit round and base the series on was the Nature of the Beast deck from the 2013 set of commander decks. This is the red, green, white deck with Marath, Will of the Wild as the lead commander. There's a couple of other legendary creatures in the deck, and what I'm going to do is when we go through the video I will just go back over this deck, because we need to look at certain issues to do with commander's abilities which are going to have an impact on our choice of pre-constructed product. So just on the screen at the moment we have that deck in question, and there's also the deck list, which, like I say, we're going to be going back through. But first up, I just thought I'd talk a little bit about commander resources on the web. Now, there's an awful lot of stuff out there on the web that you can track down, and what I have been doing is, for the previous episodes, in the description I've included a link to the EDH Commander main website. So this is the official Commander rules website that's been in existence for quite a while now, and it really just explains the general rules and philosophies of EDH Commander, whatever you want to call it. Although of course the wizards use the term Commander really because they would have had problems with the term Highlander, because there is sort of intellectual property issues there surrounding, because of its link in with the Highlander films. So that's really why it was changed over to Commander once Wizards wanted to release a sort of official product for it. And so it's also got things like the historical history of EDH Commander, the philosophy, deck construction. As you can see, it's a pretty stripped down website. Basically all the play rules. There's a forum as well on there. So just something that's a good starting point really when you're thinking about Commander. Also on the main Wizards website there is the column Command Tower, which is written by Adam Staborski, and that's been running since I think April 2013 in that format. So it's another place where you can sort of check out ideas for Commander, read about basic philosophies. So we can just go in and look at the most recent article. And we have one here about colour in Commander. So there's a resource to play around with. There's a Rurik Thar the Unbound. We'll be talking a little bit about that particular legendary creature in a moment. Also we have on Star City Games, Sheldon Menery does regular reviews for decks, for sets in relation to their applicability to Commander. And here's one for Journey into Nyx. So he subdivides it into various classifications for cards that he believed aren't likely to get played, probably will get played, definitely will get played, and all their different colours and combos. Now all of these people you can read a bit more about on various Wikipedia articles and just Googling them if you want to know what their background is in Magic. One very interesting blog I've sort of stumbled across, I think in the last couple of days, is something called Commander Theory, and I'm just starting to explore this particular Tumblr account. So this is at commandertheory.tumblr.com, but there's some really interesting articles on here about basically, building Commander decks, some of the top cards in Commander, deck list archive, how to build a deck, Magic blogs, how to evaluate cards for Commander, how to construct a mana base, those sort of things. So under the how to build deck, it links into a basic guide for how to put your deck together. Now there's an interesting point in all of this, and this is going to have implications for when you're looking at cards for any toolkit where you're building it around the Commander, is the importance of actually understanding exactly what your Commander does. So you need to think about, as the author of this Tumblr blog says, you need to start off by thinking of all the mechanical implications of the Commander's text, and then basically search for cards that are going to enable or benefit from those particular abilities. So it's a good idea to basically go through and systematically list out what's important to that Commander, what that Commander cares about. So here you can see it's been done for He Who Hungers. So it says for He Who Hungers, it needs spirits to sacrifice, needs ways to copy the ability, need ways to benefit when the spirits die, need ways to benefit when my opponents discard cards, and need ways to benefit from the cards in my opponent's graveyard. Because if you look at the area here, which is the rules text, we have flying, and for one colourless, sacrifice a spirit. Target opponent reveals his or her hand. Choose a card from it. That player discards that card. Play this ability only any time you would play a sorcery. And it also has something called Soul Shift on it. So what we need to do is, let's just look up Soul Shift. See if we can do this quickly, so we're clear about what Soul Shift can do. Soul Shift is a triggered ability. Soul Shift N means when this permanent is put into a graveyard from play, you may return target spirit card with converted mana cost N or less from your graveyard to your hand. Also, if a permanent has multiple instances of Soul Shift, each triggers separately, and there's examples on that. So this is from the wiki at mtgsalvation.com. So the point here is just one thing you need to do as part of a whole process is just understanding exactly what that Commander cares about. So just going back to our particular deck that we started with, what does Marith care about? Well, Marith cares about counters. So it enters the battlefield with a number of +1/+1 counters on it, which are equal to the amount of mana spent to cast it. So it obviously also cares about how much it costs to cast Marith. And if you remember with Commanders, each time you have to recast it, it's 2 colourless more to cast. Okay. Also, the rest of the ability, for X, remove X +1/+1 counters from Marith and choose 1. Put X +1/+1 counters on target creature, or Marith deals X damage to target creature or player, or put an XX green elemental creature token onto the battlefield. So we can look at all those modal abilities, and for each one go, okay, what does this really care about? And then we use that information to basically help us when we're choosing any pre-constructed or any sealed element to go, well, this is actually really what I'm looking for. So that's one area we need to be carefully considering when we're sort of starting off from a pre-constructed deck. It's just looking at what do we have already, what does this deck care about. We may of course chosen to use one of the other commanders, in which case our deck's going to care about different things, and we might find that maybe the deck as it stands isn't fully optimized for caring about, say, the alternative commander here, which is Mayala the Anima. So in this case we're looking at the top 5 cards of our library, so we've got a scry effect because once we've located a creature card, if there is one there, with power 5 or greater from among those and putting it onto the battlefield, we basically put the rest on the bottom of our library in any order. Now the interesting thing here is we don't get to choose, bear this in mind, we don't go, okay, we've gone through these cards, we've obviously chosen a creature card and put it on the battlefield, but then when we have to put what's remaining of our, the remaining 4 cards, they get put on the bottom, but in any order. So we don't split them, put some on the bottom, some on the top. They all go to the bottom. So that's obviously important to remember that. Then also the alternate commander, there was another one which was Gaiji, Honoured One. So what does this care about? Well, it says whenever a creature attacks one of your opponents or a planeswalker that opponent controls, that creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So again, we need to think about how that synergizes or works with other cards. Is it optimal for the cards we have in our commander deck? If not, what could we swap out in order to make it optimal, and where might we get those optimal cards from if we weren't able to buy singles for any reason? Now, one possibility open to you when you're expanding out your pool of commander product is to just simply buy other commander decks within this particular group of 5 that were issued. So you could do that, and there's a couple of ways you could approach this. One is to use an adjacent shard. So the shard here is red, green, white, so obviously we're interested in red, green or white cards or combinations thereof. And we maybe could find another deck which had common colours in it. So there's a black, red, green, so we've got red and green in here. We could purchase this deck, and maybe with that way, the very minimum, we would have 2 commander decks. But also we might find that there are certain cards within here that are on colour with the other deck. That might work. That might better synergize with a particular general. And again, it's a question of just going through, knowing exactly what your general cares about, and then working out whether there would be any cards in here that would be of use. Or is one of the other commanders, does that have an ability which synergizes well with other cards? So like I said, you could go through and look at adjacent stuff. So what else we got? We got the evasive maneuvers, which has green, white, blue. So green and white are the common 2 colors, and similar sort of process. Just going through, is there anything here? What we don't want to end up necessarily is where we've got too much overlap, where actually there's identical cards in both decks that we're just creating 2 ofs. That's fine if we maybe want to build more decks with the same cards in, but if we're looking to just have one deck that we just swap stuff out of, those more than one ofs become effectively dead cards in that particular situation. But if we're looking to build other decks where those cards may be considered staples, then that would be fine. So first thing really is just look at the other commander decks and just see if there is any interesting synergy between the same colors in other decks. So moving on to actual products outside of the commander range, what do we have? Well, probably the thing I would consider looking at first is something like the commander product, the dual deck product. So there's been a number of dual decks now. Elves versus Goblins it started with, and we had Jace versus Chandra, Divine versus Demonic, then Garrick versus Liliana. And you can see there's sort of a pattern emerging here, where apart from this area here, where they did two Planeswalker dual decks back to back, it was generally considered that they were going to go Planeswalker and then a theme deck or a tribal deck, and it was going to alternate. So for more recent, it's sort of gone back to this, where here we've got Venser versus Koth, Izzet versus Golgari, Sorin versus Tybalt, Heroes versus Monsters, Jace versus Vraska, and then Speed versus Cunning, which hasn't been released yet. So the last deck was Jace versus Vraska, and the one before that is Heroes versus Monsters. Now obviously the older these go back, the less likely you're going to see them at box stores. So at the moment I'm mainly seeing these two decks that are still out on the shelves. Not so much here, but sometimes you get occasionally the odd deck may turn up. So let's have a quick look at the deck list for Jace versus Vraska, which is the most recent one. So the first thing we need to do, what are the common colours that that are in these decks in relation to our commander deck? So we're playing green, white, red. So first up, well, we have a blue deck here, the Jace deck. So not a lot of similarity here in terms of being on colour. Obviously, if we'd chosen one of the other commander decks, which did have blue in it, then you would want to go through this and just see if there are any synergies in this particular dual decks product. Now, the other interesting thing about dual decks, which is really good from a commander point of view, I think, is that you can see there's lots of one-offs. Also, the cards tend to be pulled from throughout Magic's history. They're not dependent on, say, standard. So often you'll find you get very interesting mana bases going on, that sort of thing. The other deck, which is the Vraska, part of the Jace versus Vraska dual deck, this is in green-black. So we've got, again, an interesting mana base. We've got a Golgari Guildgate in there, we've got a Rogue's Passage, we've got a Tainted Wood. Again, lots of one-offs. The only time they tend to have a couple of something is if it's maybe an instant removal where they need a bit more consistency in the deck, or there's some other reason why there's a certain deck synergy which just having one of isn't going to be really working. But they do, I think the most you ever tend to get copies of in the decks, apart from basic lands, is two ofs. So for this particular dual deck, there's only one colour that is similar, which is the green. And as the deck here, the Planeswalker here, really cares about, I would call this deck is an assassin based deck. So this would be probably fantastic if you were trying to build up an assassin themed EDH deck, maybe using one of the commander decks that was already in black and green, and see if there was something that synergized with some of Vraska's stuff in addition to whatever commander that was there. So maybe a Golgari themed stuff going on in the deck. So that's a possible angle, but certainly not for our deck. Interestingly, the most on colour recent dual deck would be the Heroes versus Monsters. Now this is a very appealing deck for a number of different reasons. One thing is we've got a couple of legendary creatures in the deck. One is Precons, which is actually the lead card from one of the decks in the duel deck, this duel deck, and as such is in foil. The other legendary creature is Anax and Cynamide, which isn't in foil because it's not the lead card, and that is in the Heroes deck. With the Heroes deck, the lead card is actually Sun Titan, so we've got a nice foil Sun Titan. So whatever the lead card is in the dual decks, that's always foiled. So the Heroes deck is red-white, has a scry land in it, a couple of scry lands, has Figure of Destiny, has another legendary creature, Camel Pit Fighter as well. Just get that a bit center screen. So again, you'd have to sort of go through the deck list here and just see what synergies have I got, or how useful are the creatures going to be in my pre-existing commander deck. I'm certainly very drawn to the fact we have Sun Titan in here, in addition to the other commanders, which will sort of open up other possibilities of building other decks. Again, we might have to hunt down further cards to basically have enough synergistic cards to actually work with that. In the monsters deck, what else do we have here? Well, we've got a Kazandu Refuge, which taps for green, red and green, comes into the battlefield tapped, does give you life gain. So another thing we notice with the decks is there does seem to be some form of life smoothing in there. So it may be this card, if you've already got a comes into play tapped land which generates red and green, but it doesn't do anything else, then you could use this as a substitute, because as an added bonus this is smoothing your life gain. We've got a Scarg of the Rage Pits. It's going to give target creatures +1/+1 and trample, as in addition to adding colourless mana. We've got Plecranus World Eater in here, which is a legendary, which I think was mentioned further up the article. There we go. So this has monstrosity. So I definitely would be very interested in this deck. It would be great to just play around with some of the cards. Now you could go into more detail and really start to analyze all the synergies in here and just work out really whether it was a worthwhile purchase. But certainly just on first pass, there's some great cards in here just to play around with on there. So this definitely, I think, is going to feature in a future episode, an unboxing and going into a bit more detail. So that's the sort of second most recent duel deck. Then we move on to the whole area of pre-constructed theme decks and intros. Oh, didn't want that to happen. So we've got a bit of a free Bella Line advert there. So theme decks, intro decks have been going on for an awful long time now in Magic, and what you're going to tend to find is any box store, they're probably going to mainly have mostly whatever theme decks and intro decks would be currently standard legal. I'm going to go back a little bit further because I have seen some from Magic 2013. But I just wanted to again in overview just go through some sort of theme deck related information. Anyway, so let's just move on to the actual theme decks themselves. So looking at Magic 2013, we have a Forest Mountain deck called Mob Rule, where the lead card was Krenko Mob Boss. Now our current pool of cards doesn't have an awful lot of goblins, if any. So if you were going to get this as a complement to your EDH deck, you would almost be starting off afresh, and so you would be looking for certain one-ofs that would complement this. So it would be nice to have a nice full foily Krenko mob boss as an EDH commander, but you'd have to do a lot of infilling with other cards, which wouldn't necessarily, if you just started off with a commander deck from the pre-constructed 5, wouldn't really have necessarily cards which you could use. Also, it's a mono-color commander, so again you'd have to find a lot more red staples that would be available to you. And on the subject of staples, something that was really useful on this site, there was a section, if I can just find it, on top cards in Commander. So here we go. So these are really good pointers for just putting you in the right direction. Again, useful way, one, if you're just buying singles, but secondly, if you're having to rely on precons, maybe just highlighting up, okay, the following, I know a precon where there's quite a few of these in, why don't I get that? That would be one angle that you could use in just pre-selecting a precon. Now that's going to be hard because an awful lot of these cards are were originally printed before the current standard, but just an approach there. Also, somewhere on this site there is actually a link to other staples, other lists of staples, and I can't exactly remember where it is, but it is somewhere on this site actually, because there are a number of websites that run sort of lists of staples. So anyway, going back to our precons, and what I'm going to do is just highlight all of the decks recently that are on colour, and then when I come to do, maybe if I ever do make a precon selection for the toolkit, what I could do is pick those ones that are on colour, and there's bound to be one, I suspect, somewhere that's going to be okay for that. So moving on to return to Ravnica, we have Selesnya Surge, which is in green-white. So again, something to look at is look at the mana base. Are there any interesting non-basic lands in there that you would want to use? Look at the creatures. Are there any useful creatures that would work in the deck, which have particular synergies with your commander, or particular abilities that might help? And then the other spells, again, is there anything there that's going to work in what you have, both either in your commander deck or in your toolkit, if you've started to build up a considerable volume of toolkit staples that you've acquired through product. So on this particular set, I think that's the only one that's on colour. So that's, and the other thing is actually it's pretty easy, forgot to say, in this particular block, because the colour pairs have particular names. So green-white is Selesnya, red-green is Gruul, and white-red is Boros. So all we've really got to do is for each of the 3 sets in the block is just look for the precon which was prefixed with that particular title. So in this particular set, in the Return to Ravnica, there was an Azuris deck, there was an Izzet deck, there was a Rakdos, a Golgari, and a Selesnya, which we looked at. So that's the only one that's totally on colour there. Now that's not to say you couldn't choose one of the other decks if there was a matching colour, but you're less, the probability of you getting matches in terms of just the cards which are on colour with your commander deck are obviously going to be a lot less, because there's a lot less of that colour in the deck, or a lot less of the on colours in your deck. So moving on to Gatecrash, we've got Gruul, which is a red-green deck, has a Gruul Guildgate in it, and there's guild gates are already heavily featured in the Commander product. Arbor Alf, Centaur Corsa. Again, you know, we'll go through it in a lot more detail when I get to sort of precons generally, or intro decks, should I say, in a later video. But again, you know, you could just do a quick overview, see if there's anything that really grabs your attention in this deck. In this particular set, there is another intro deck which is on colour, which is the Boros Battalion deck. Again, you know, is there anything interesting in the non-basic lands? Maybe any interesting land artwork is another thing you might be after. Any interesting multicoloured stuff that might have synergies? Any interesting removal? Not all sorts of removal work well in Commander decks because, of course, of the fact that there's only one-offs. Any interesting cards that allow you to steal your opponent's stuff. And Dragon's Maze. So we've got a Gruul Siege deck which had, interestingly enough, Rarekthar the Unbowed. So if you were thinking about using this as a commander, one thing that's important is to look at the ability on here. It's got Vigilance, it's got Reach. It attacks each turn if able, so very aggressive when it's in play. 6 casting cost for a 6/6. Whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, Rarekthar deals 6 damage to that player. So this particular legendary creature, if you're going to use it in any deck, it needs to be in a deck where you're mostly playing creature spells, because every non-creature spell that you cast, it'll do 6 damage to you, because it is whenever a player. That could be any player. So if we were looking to this, buying this deck because of the commander, and we were looking at using our red-green cards in our existing commander deck, then we would have to be really careful about spell selection. More Gruul Guild Gates, so we wouldn't be short of those. Number of larger creatures in here as well. And again, just checking out removal, checking out mana fixing. Later, like the clue stones. And again, you'd have to sort of evaluate this and work out, is this sort of 3 mana fixing, does it work in Commander? And moving on to Magic 2014. So here we have the Light Force deck, which is Forest Plains. So that will be on colour. Got Dajani's Chosen. This one looks like, again, goes very much off theme in terms of what our existing commander deck does. A lot of there's some enchantments in here, a bit of life gain going on. So this very much cares about enchantments. We do have some counter stuff in here. Voracious Worm enters the battlefield with X+1/+1 counters on it. I'm just trying to remember what was actually in our deck in terms of worms and things that had +1/+1 counters on them. Just looking at the enchantments in here. I don't think there was anything else in this particular set that was on colour. I think the Fire Surge was actually a blue-red deck. Yeah. Garrick's or Bestial Strength is actually green-black. So not totally on colour, which is what we're mainly looking for in this discussion. Then we've got Theros, so we've got Blazing Beasts of Myth. Another red-green. And again, just nothing particularly special here. Standard basic lands. It mainly looks like a sort of Minotaur Satyr deck. That's moving on because we're just getting a bit of an overview. Forged in Battle was a Mountain Plains deck. Acrone, a lot of Acrone. So very heavy human based deck. Some flyers in here. Looking to see what enchantments. It's got a lot of instants which don't tend to work so well in a commander deck where there's one-offs unless it makes a real big impact on the board state. What's the Ordeal of Perforus? Enchant creature. Whenever enchanted creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it. And if it has 3 or more +1/+1 counters on it, sacrifice Ordeal of Perforus. When you sacrifice Ordeal of Perforus, it deals 3 damage to target creature or player. So pretty convoluted and not too reliable in a one-off. Insatiable Hunger. It's another deck where both colours are on colour. Nothing special in the mana base. I think this is a tribute deck. Yep. Got a tribute theme. As the creature enters the battlefield, an opponent of your choice may place 3 +1/+1 counters on it. When Nessian Demlock enters the battlefield, if tribute wasn't paid, destroy target non-creature permanent. So that would actually be really interesting in a deck that cares about counters. Yeah, I'm just trying to see whether you could steal counters off another creature somehow. Just got to recheck the ability there. Yeah, if you're going to be caring about counters, it's nice to be able to move stuff around somehow. Fairly easily. So that's only the enchanted creature. And then journey into Nyx. So with this one, what do we got? We got a Mortals of Myth deck, which is on colour. Forest Plains. What do we got? Heroic ability. Whenever you cast a spell that targets Dawnbringer Charioteers, put a +1/+1 counter on Dawnbringer Charioteers. Just checking to see if there were any other decks in here which were on colour. I don't think so. Nope, that was the only one. So again, what you're really doing is before you start making a choice, you're just getting a feel for actually what decks are even on colour. Hang on. Did I? Mortals of Myth, yeah, that was the one. Yeah, okay. So beyond the intro decks and just basically focusing on firstly on color and then just working out, you know, whether the abilities are relevant to your commander or the deck synergies that are there as a result of a particular commander. There are a couple of other products out there which are, you know, fall into the category of they being sealed product, and there is a pre-constructed element to them. One is premium decks, of which there's only ever been 3. One of the appeals of these is that they're all foil, but they are themed heavily, so they would be only in use in commander decks where you're already going down that theme. So the theme was slithers, burn, and reanimation. So for instance, if you had a mono red deck and you wanted nice foily lands, plus you wanted sort of classic red spells in there, then you might want to consider looking at the fire and lightning deck to see what's in it. Now again, you have to bear in mind some of these spells may not work so well as one-offs in an EDH deck. Now the other product which did have a certain element of predictability, although there were, as it said in the marketing blurb, semi-random elements, was the Deck Builder's Toolkit. Now your line of sort of thinking with this is you just have to look at the fixed content and decide, are there enough staples in here to warrant me buying the product, firstly. In the semi-random element, where which are basically in your deck, you had 4 groups of 10 cards out of a total possible groups of 11. So each box, or Deck Builder's Toolkit, would pull out 4 from this list. So that's the luck element, and then the even bigger luck element in this is the booster packs. There's actually 4 booster packs in here. Now when they launched it, mine actually came from had the booster packs from M13, so I think it was M13, M14, Return to Ravnica, Gatecrash, but there wasn't a Dragon's Maze. Now they could have done this at the time, because Dragon's Maze, I'm just trying to think whether it was actually, it was out, because M14 was out, but for some bizarre reason they didn't include one of those. So again, if you're thinking about Commander, one of the best blocks for Commander is the Return to Ravnica block, because of the multicolour guilds in it, basically. So in terms of like pushing luck in your favour, this might be this would be certainly a good thing. Is if you just wanted the thrill of cracking some packs, then that would certainly be one to select. But you can't guarantee what you're going to pull. You could open a 4 packs and find that yes, you've got stuff that's on colour, but there's probably going to be no legendaries, no staples or anything that could be relevant. It's just pure luck. So with the Deck Builder's Toolkit, what I would say is it's not the best thing to choose. If you need the basic lands, then fine. If you find that what you're after, a heavy amount of the fixed content is what you're after, then fine. But the semi-random element is obviously unpredictable, as are the boosters. But I just thought I would mention the Deck Builder's Toolkit, because that's bound to come up. So really, just in summary, as I've said, remember there's lots of resources out there for Commander beyond just the 4 I've mentioned. Look at the other Commander decks as a way of seeing, do I want a second deck? Does it need to be overlapped in some way, or do I want to just have cards which are completely unrelated? So I've got 2 decks, and it just gives me more opportunities in the toolkit. The dual decks, I would say, would be certainly my first choice in terms of an in-depth look at useful cards in them. But again, you're only likely to find the 2 most recent Duel Decks out there in box store land. And then moving on to really the other precons, like the intros, which are what we mostly see at box stores. You really have to just focus in on color combinations and in the first instance what on color decks are there, and then go through them systematically. And the whole going through systematically I'm actually going to look at in a later video, but certainly my next video is going to revolve around the heroes versus monsters and its sort of applicability to our toolkit. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye for now.